There is nothing I can think of that would give the country, both business and consumers, more confidence than to see a longer-term plan of reform that restores fiscal sustainability. Now, I am often asked, how is long-term reform consistent with short-term recovery? Well, quite apart from building desperately needed confidence, the plan itself could be instituted, but not implemented until the economy was recovering, so that we have the benefits of the long-term effects of confidence without in any way limiting the recovery on the short term. Well, you know, it's become easy and glib to say that we need to invest more in order to grow. But we tend, in making those glib statements, to ignore the melancholy realities that we are facing long term. For example, economists agree on very few things, but I think most of them agree that debt to GDP above 60% is not prudent, and debt to GDP at 90% has a very negative effect on growth. We are not talking about 60 or 90%. We're talking about long-term estimates of 150 to 200% of GDP, totally unsustainable. So the fundamental question that we are avoiding is, however unanimous we are that we need to invest more, in the context of these debts, where do we get the resources to invest? For example, the Peterson Institute has estimated that in 25 years, our interest payments as a percent of GDP will skyrocket to nearly 12% of the GDP. That's 3 times or more the total federal investment in education, in R&D, in training, and in infrastructure. And let's talk a bit about the interest costs, which after all are not about the future, they're about the past, and they have nothing to do with investment. They stand in the way of investment. So fundamentally, we're dealing here with a conflict between our unanimous agreement that we want to grow in the future and we need to invest in the future, but we are not answering the tough question of where we get the resources to do that investment. Well, first of all, we need fundamental reform of our entitlements. Because if you take entitlements plus interest costs, that explains the entire increase in spending over the long term. That includes Social Security, Medicaid, and most emphatically Medicare, which is, of course, by far the biggest and toughest problem. But in doing so, we must be very careful, in my view, to preserve the safety net for the vulnerable in our society. Then we have the question, the painful question in some quarters, of more revenues versus more spending cuts. Our research staff at the Foundation has produced an analysis of how much we would have to increase spending or decrease spending if we wanted to rely totally on spending cuts. They come up with the rather startling number that we would have to have a 37% across the board cut in spending in order to stabilize debt to GDP. I would find that draconian, politically impossible, and, in my view, immoral. Then we have a subject we haven't spent much time on, but which I think we're going to need to focus on: defense spending. The public may not know that we spend more on defense than the next 17 countries combined. If we look at how big a percent of the GDP we spend versus the rest of the developed world, it's roughly twice as much. And that gap would be enough for us to double our R&D investment in the United States. Now, I have here a quote from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mike Mullen, who said, and I want to quote this so that there's no confusion about what he said, "The single biggest threat to our national security is our debt. The Pentagon budget has basically doubled in the last decade, and in doubling, we have lost the ability to prioritize, to make hard decisions, to do tough analysis, to make trades." So here we are, spending approximately a total of $1.6 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now that would buy us a lot of investment. So I believe it is long past due to do a strategic review of the basic threats and the basic missions of our military in the total context of the national interest. So our foundation feels strongly enough about this that we are in the early stages of doing such a review with the help of some of the ablest people in defense that we at least can find.